In this video, I'm going to show you how you can manage changes to your database schema and other configuration on Hasura through its migrations and metadata features. So firstly, a quick primer for anyone who doesn't know what migrations are. One of the problems when working with databases is that the schema evolves over time, and you can also have different instances of your databases. So I might make changes to my schema, but I need my colleague who's working on the same project to get those same changes and apply them to their database. And then we might need to apply those changes onwards to staging and production and so on. And at each point, the schema needs to match with the source code that is expecting those changes to be there. The typical solution to this is to describe changes that occur to the database schema as they happen through migrations, which are small SQL files that describe the change. We can then store these in source control, so that way they're versioned and they match up with the source code that depend on them being there. So in this video, I'm going to show you how Hasura can generate migrations. Also on Hasura, there's a related concept of metadata. And this is all the Hasura-specific configuration that's separate from the database schema, but it affects the GraphQL API. So things like permissions, relationships, event triggers, actions, and so on. So all of that stuff also needs to be stored in files so that we can keep it in source control and version it and share it with other people. So again, I'm going to show you how you can configure Hasura to generate files that describe its metadata. The first problem with this is how can we get a Hasura instance to generate files on our local disk? Currently, I'm just running a local instance through Docker, so it wouldn't be impossible to get that working so that it would generate migration files to my local disk. But it's entirely possible that we could be working against a remote instance, in which case it's going to be impossible for that remote instance to directly write files to our local disk. The solution is to use the Hasura CLI, which is the command line tool provided by the Hasura team, which is used to manage migrations and metadata. So the first step in this video is to install the CLI. There is a page on the official documentation which describes installing the CLI, which you can get directly from their GitHub repository. But it also mentions an alternative, even though this is actually maintained by a third party, which is to install it via npm. And personally, I much prefer doing that because it manages versioning much better. And it also means that we can install the CLI on a per project basis, which personally I think is much better than installing it globally. Make sure that you can have a specific version pinned to a project and that you can install all your dependencies just in one go. So that's what I'm going to do. So switching back to my IDE, you can see I've got my Hasura instance running locally. And I'm going to open a new terminal and just npm install --save dev Hasura CLI, and then wait for that to install. And once that's done, you'll be able to run the CLI with the command npx. Notice that it's x, not m, Hasura. So if we run that, we can see that it's installed. And the npx is what makes it run the version that's installed in your local node modules. So this will be slightly different from the documentation, which will tend to just refer to the general Hasura command. That's only useful if you've installed Hasura globally. In order to use the CLI, we now have to initialize a Hasura CLI project. So we do that by running npx hasura init. You then give the name of the project directory. I'm going to leave it as Hasura because I quite like it the way we have back-end, front-end, Hasura, all quite neatly organized. And if we look in that folder, we can see that what it's created is metadata, and it'll have a load of files, although I suspect these are largely empty. Migrations, that is currently empty. And then this important file here, config.yaml. We do need to look at this file. This is the file that we use to tell the CLI where it can find the Hasura instance that we're working against. It already defaults to localhost 8080, which of course is what we are doing, so we actually don't need to change anything that's already here, although if you're working against a remote Hasura instance, that's where you'd want to put the endpoint. But we did earlier in this course set up an admin secret so that our Hasura API wasn't public. And so we do need to put that in because otherwise the CLI isn't going to know how it can communicate with the Hasura instance. So you just add an admin secret field, and by default in the Docker Compose file, it's my admin secret key. So yours is probably the same. Now, if we were working against a completely fresh, brand new Hasura instance that had no tables, no data, no schema at all, then we would basically be ready to go. But in our case, we have an existing Hasura instance that's already got a load of schema that we defined earlier in this course. So if you're in that situation, there's another step that you have to do, which is to generate the initial migration. Because right now our migrations is empty, but we need an initial migration that's going to describe the current state of the database schema so that we can put that into source control, and then that's the starting point for the rest of our migrations. We can do that by following this step in the official documentation, and I'm going to point it out to you because I think it's one of those things that you're not going to remember. You only probably do it once per project, and only those times when there was an existing schema. So whenever you need to do that, you'll just want to look up this step here, step 3, in the documentation, which I'll put a link to in the description. And it's these two commands here. So you can see that we're calling Hasura migrate create, so create a migration. That's the name of the migration, just init to say that it's the initial migration. And then the important thing you can see is this -- from server, and that basically means get the current state of the schema from the server, rather than generating an empty migrations file. So, and don't forget, we're going to prepend this with npx because of the way we've installed the CLI. So let's go ahead and execute that. We need to, first of all, we need to change into the Hasura project directory, else this won't work. And then we're going to run npx Hasura migrate create init -- from server, and then -- database name. And what you need to provide here is actually the name of the database connection, not the name of the database in Postgres terms. So earlier in this course, I suggested that you name that connection default. So that's what mine is. And then just press enter, and you'll see that it says that it's succeeded. And if we look in the migrations, we'll see our very first migration. It's got an up migration. It doesn't have a down, because in this case, we're assuming there's no situation where we would ever want to undo this migration, because it's kind of the initial starting point. And in there, you can see all this SQL that describes the state of our database at the moment. The second step is that although we've created that migration from the current database, Hasura still doesn't realize that that has effectively already been applied to this database. So that's what this command is going to do. We're going to say we want to apply a migration. We provide the version, which came as the output from the previous command, but we don't actually want to apply it in the sense that it's already there. We don't need to actually execute the SQL. We just need to kind of mark it as having already been done. Let's go ahead and execute that. So it's npx Hasura migrate apply -- version, and then in there we need to copy in the version that came from the previous command -- skip execution, and same database name. And also a little tip, to spell migrate properly, because otherwise it won't know what you mean. Once we have that out of the way, we can start actually using the CLI the way it's meant to be used for generating migrations and metadata. And the way that that works is that you tell the CLI to run its own version of the Hasura console. And this is how the CLI is able to write things to your local disk, because you're running this console through the CLI as opposed to on the Hasura instance itself. I'll show you what I mean. We're going to run npx Hasura console. And the message you get tells you that it's running a console at this other port. Okay, so this is a different port from our actual instance. So let's go ahead and paste that. What you'll get is a console that looks identical to the one that we've been using already earlier in this course. So let's open that up as well. So normally we run localhost 8080, and these two things look identical. Well, apart from the fact that had a bit of state in there already, but otherwise they are completely identical. But the big difference between the two is that when we make changes to the schema on this instance, so this is connected directly to the Hasura instance, then it will not generate metadata and migrations on the local disk. But if we make changes to the schema through this instance, it will. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to go to the Data tab, and just as a little example, I'm going to try creating a new table, which I'm going to call tags. So the idea is that maybe my blog posts for my blog that I'm implementing, I want to start having a set of predefined tags that I can apply to blog posts. I'm not actually going to fully implement that. I'm just going to use it as an example for the schema. So I'll have an ID and a name, for example. As soon as I save this and get the confirmation that it was added, let's switch back to the code and have a look in the migrations, and you'll see that it has generated this directory here, create table public tags, and you can see that it's automatically generated this migration with the SQL command that it used to create the table, and also one to reverse it as well, so that we can go back in time if we ever need to, if we need to check out like an older version of the source code. So that's all we have to do to generate migrations from this point on. We just start working with the console user interface like we have been all this time, but we do it through the CLI one, and that will automatically generate all of these files. Likewise, if I, let's say, go to permissions, so I'm going to do something now that is not part of the database schema, because the permission system doesn't live at the database level, but it is part of the metadata. So let's say, I don't know, I'm allowed to select on these columns, and I'm allowed to, let's say, sorry, that was insert on those columns, and I'm allowed to update just that column. You'll be able to see this reflected in the metadata directory. You don't need to fully understand what these files are, of course, they're for Hasura to deal with, but it is interesting to at least understand. So in this case, I think we want to look under databases, and then, yeah, you'll see all these YAML files that describe the various tables, and on here we can see where the permissions have been defined. So this is something we can now commit to source control, and we can share it with our colleagues, and then they will have this description that will allow them to synchronize their Hasura instance with yours. So speaking of which, we haven't looked at how we actually apply these migrations and metadata to an existing instance. So we've seen how we can generate them from our instance, but what if now we're in the situation where our colleague has sent us the latest versions of their metadata or migrations, or more likely we've pulled them from source control, and now we need to apply them to our Hasura instance so that we are up to date with all the latest changes. Well, that's really simple. Just going to open a new terminal so I can keep the console running. We go into the Hasura directory, and then we just run npx hasura migrate apply. Now, initially, nothing's going to happen. Yeah, it'll prompt you for which database you want to use. But this time, nothing is going to happen because, of course, we're already up to date. But if there were new migrations in this folder that we just pulled from, from source control, they would then be applied at this point. Likewise, the equivalent for metadata is the same, but npx hasura metadata apply instead. And just to illustrate what that would look like, let's suppose that we'll just simulate this by saying that we pulled from our Git repository, let's say, and our colleague had decided, oh no, actually, we don't want to allow insertion of the ID column there because it's auto-generated. So they've made this change. So now, at this point, our local metadata file is more up-to-date than our actual Hasura instance, which means that when we run metadata apply, it's going to see that change. And if we go back to the console and refresh, you can see, so you might have noticed that just changed to a filter symbol instead of a tick, because there's now only one column that it's allowed to insert instead of two. So you can see how it applied those changes based on the files on the disk. So that's basically it for metadata and migrations. There are lots of other more advanced features, but generally I find I don't need most of those. On day-to-day, those commands that I've just showed are all I ever need. There's just two little features that I do think are worth showing you first of all, though. The first is that we have this weird situation, as we've noted, where we've got these two consoles, and if we were to accidentally use this console, the one that's on the actual instance itself, then we wouldn't be generating metadata. And that could cause us a lot of confusion because we might make changes to the schema and then they wouldn't be reflected in our local files and we wouldn't realize this had happened and we could get ourselves into a mess. So one thing we might want to consider doing is disabling that console, and that's really easy to do. You do it through the environment variables. So because we are running through Docker, those environment variables are in the Docker Compose file. And you can see there's already a comment that tells us what to do. We quite simply set that to false. And once we've done that, if we were to restart the service, we will find that we can no longer access the console. And that generally, I think, is a good safety mechanism to try and force people to only use the console, the CLI console, and not ever get confused. The other thing that can be a bit of a pain is remembering to apply the metadata and migrations in the first place. And one thing that you can do just to help with that, doesn't solve all cases, but just to try and prevent you forgetting, is to configure the Docker instance so that it automatically applies those migrations and metadata every time it starts up. The configuration for that is once again in the Docker Compose file. But the way it works is we actually use a different image that's provided by the Hasura team that's been configured to apply the migrations on startup. The image name is the same, but it is followed by .cli-migrations-v3. And I think the v3 there is referring to the version of the migrations system, which is why it doesn't match with the actual Hasura version. But the thing is, by default, this Docker container can't read or write files on our local disk, so we need to tell it that it's allowed to do that. And we do that by putting volumes, and then it's going to be a list, and we put ./Hasura/migrations. So that's the path on our local disk, so it's going to depend on what name we chose for our CLI project. Obviously, in this video, I chose Hasura. And then we basically say that that is mapped onto Hasura-migrations in the root. That's where it's expecting to look inside the Docker container. So that bit will always be the same. The actual image assumes that that's where it's going to look, whereas this depends on how you set up your migrations and where you actually set up the project file. So we do that for migrations, and then we do another one for metadata. Just to prove to you that's working, I'm going to bring down the service again, restart it. Oh, that's another typo. Sorry, that should have been migrations plural. Let's run that again. It may take a little bit of time because it's a new image that it needs to download. And then when it's done, you'll get a whole load of output that's very difficult to parse, but somewhere in there you will see some steps where it's trying to apply the metadata and migrations. Oh yeah, and here it is, applying migrations on database, and you'll see there's one for the metadata up here. The very last thing I'm going to show you is how you can capture custom SQL in your migrations. One option you have is to simply create your own migrations manually. So you can use the migrate create command to create yourself an empty migration, and then you can simply write the SQL yourself. Or a kind of shorthand is to go to the console, go to SQL, and to enter your command in here, but ticking the "this is a migration" box. So I'm going to give you an example of when you're likely to need to do this. Way back in the second video, I showed you how to define enums, and we populated the enum table, so it was this activity type, with three values like created, published and unpublished. The thing is that because those values are defining an enum, we could really consider those part of the schema, and therefore we want them to be defined in migrations. But by default, it won't have put any data into migrations unless you specifically tell it to, like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type the SQL for that. So insert into blog post activity type. And let's say that I'm adding a new value into this enum. Let's call it updated. And I want to track this through a migration. So once I've typed that SQL, I can just type, this is a migration. Let's call it add updated activity type. Click run. And not only will it have added our new enum, but you'll see that it generated a migration for us. The one downside of doing this is that it is not capable of generating downward migrations. So we've got to write this bit manually. In this case, it's nice and easy. We simply delete from blog post activity type where name equals updated. And so that's how you can include custom SQL commands, particularly when you're inserting data that you want to be part of your schema into your migrations. So that's it for metadata and migrations. And unless I add any videos in the future, this is also the last video in this course. So I really hope you enjoyed it. I'd really love to hear any feedback. And if you'd like to show your thanks or encourage me to make more of these, then the easiest things you can do are subscribe to the channel, like the video, and of course, share with anyone that you think might be interested. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help us to make more, please click the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.